Mexican Association of International Studies and the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, I extend a warm welcome to our panelists and to all the attendees. This event will be conducted as follows. Our speaker has 60 minutes to give his presentation. The attendees can send their questions in the chat. If someone wants to ask the question personally, let me know, then we can open the mic to them. And at the end of the panel, we will have 20 minutes for a Q&A session. So before giving the floor to our speaker, I invite you all to visit the virtual publishing newsroom of the Mexican Association of International Studies, whose link will be sent in the chat. This keynote lecture entitled Building Peace in Africa, from the Quest of the State to the Pan-African Project, is given by Delidji Degila, who has extensive experience. So I will give you a brief outline of his career. Native from Benin and trained as diplomat at the National School of Administration, ENA, Mr. Degila completed a doctorate in political science, international relations at the Université Jean Moulin, Lyon 3 in France. He is professor of practice of international relations at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. His research interests range from international politics to migration and health issues in the Global South and African peace and security challenges. He was a visiting professor of African politics at Komajo and Waseda universities in Japan. He was also given lectures at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the Singapore Management University, l'Institut d'études africaines de l'Université Mohamed V au Maroc, and the African University of Technology and Management, among others. Professor Degila is active in several academic organizations, including the International Studies Association, where he currently chairs the Global South Caucus Department. He serves as member of several advisory boards worldwide and advises governments and international organizations such as the African Union, l'Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, the West African Economic and Monetary Union, and the United Nations. As politician and lawyer, he combines rigorous transdisciplinary analysis and policy-making perspective with the purpose of studying complex dynamics that shape the praxis along his lines of research. Finally, he is conducting a long-term project on the role of African states in contemporary global governance from International Geneva. Without further ado, I give the floor to our speaker, Mr. Degila. The mic is yours.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup pour ces propos très aimables. Thank you very much for your generous introduction, dear colleague. First of all, I would like to thank AME President, Professor Damaso Morales Ramirez, for his kind invitation. I'm honored to add my voice to this vibrant conversation in the framework of the annual convention of AME. I also would like to express my appreciation to my Mexican colleagues of the IAPSS Global South Caucus, EXCOM, Professor Consuelo Davila, Mariana Aparicio, for their great service over the last 2 years. As you may know, the Global South Caucus is of the International Studies Association, is an academic platform dedicated to promoting the study of the South as a whole, relevant South societies in the North, and relations between the North and South within the international society. I have a very good souvenir of my last trip in Mexico, where I enjoyed A warm welcome from colleagues from CIDE, Jorge Chiavon, from UNAB, Sylvia Nunes. Thanks for your collegiality. Before I start my remarks, I must extend my sincere thanks to Professor Valeria Valle from Universidad Iberoamericana, with whom we are completing an edited volume of the International Development Policy Journal on a critical issue of governing migration from the Global South. Merci, chère Valeria, pour cette formidable collaboration. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students, the title of my presentation is Building Peace in Africa, from the quest of the state to the Pan-African project. Let me try to share my screen with you. Okay. Can you see the my slide?
Yes.
Okay. So actually, this title is a pretext for me to invite you to decenter how we think international relations today in what Amitav Acharya termed a multiplex configuration, and that I call a pluriversal world. So my presentation for the coming 30 to 35 minutes will broadly focus on how we should approach our discipline in a more holistic and broad perspective. And I'm using Africa and as a framework to deal with such issues. It has become commonplace to depict Africa as the most conflicting region in the world, especially its sub-Saharan part, which experienced diverse armed conflict and crisis. As you know, newspaper used to mention the situation in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Democratic Republic of Congo, Côte d'Ivoire, Central African Republic, Somalia, and I can continue. To understand security challenges in Africa, it's crucial to focus on the state-building process in the region, in a context where many African states supposedly failed to keep the monopoly of the legitimate use of force, following a Weberian definition of the state. This conventional rhetoric is so common that some political scientists stated that African state is neither a state nor African. And here I refer to the work of Pierre Engelbert. This conventional approach is problematic, and I would like to start my remarks by challenging such simplistic approach on state building in Africa by drawing precisely on Max Weber's methodological thoughts on the concept of ideal type. And I quote him, "An ideal type is formed by the one-sided accentuation of one or several aspects and through the synthesis of a plethora of individual phenomena. In its conceptual purity, this mental image cannot be found empirically anywhere in reality. It is a utopia. Africa is huge and complex, as you can see on these slides. You can find in a very geographic perspective within the territory of the continent, China plus India plus US plus Europe. Thus, a conventional understanding of modern African states, or modern state applied to Africa should be reconsidered. Indeed, African states are characterized by a particular history. And here I would like to mention three main elements. The first one is the colonial experience, which led to the destruction of indigenous political organizations. You have to keep in mind that before the colonial powers came in Africa, there were several forms of political organization. And I can refer here to the Empire of Ghana, the Kingdom of Benin, my native country, Empire of Mali, Empire Songhai, etc. So the colonial experience precisely destroyed all these forms of political organization. The second aspect it's important to remind is the Berlin Conference, 1884, 1885, which led to what we called the Balkanization of Africa. Otto von Bismarck, who was the emperor of Germany, organized this conference in order to basically share the big African cake with other leaders or other colonial leaders. Third aspect to keep in mind is the decolonization and independence period in 1950s, 1960s, which led to the Westphalian types of political entities recognized as modern African states and grounded on the legal principle of uti possidetis juris. So taking into consideration such trajectory to reflect on state building process in Africa is important because, as underlined by critical historians of area discipline, theory making in area in its foundational moments was driven by an imperial agenda of silencing alternative narratives emerging from the decolonizing world. One example of such tropism is related to the ethnic explanation of civil war in Africa. The problem is how this concept has been constructed in the region. According to Ilekia Mbokolo, Congolese historian, the notion of ethnicity is an arbitrary and restrictive construction designed by colonial powers in Africa to impose their control over the continent. And I quote him, as many other primitive categories applied to African societies, ethnicity is a token archaism. A paradigmatic illustration of such process is the case of Rwanda, where, as you know, Hutu and Tutsi ethnic groups have been designed and systematized by colonial powers. And everybody knows what happened in the 1990s. So let me here remind that in May 1963, the founders of the Organization of African unity, today African Union, faced a Cornelian situation. Two options for them. Or they decide to draw frontiers of forthcoming independent African states with the risk to open the Pandora box, or they keep boundaries delimitations inherited from the colonial period. They eventually decided to keep the borders inherited from the colonial powers, with the challenge to build modern African state within artificial boundaries determined without taking into consideration what should be the cornerstone of any state building process: people. So today we have Africa as a very diverse region comprised, as you can see, of 55 heterogeneous states. And this is the byproduct of the colonial experience. What I really would like to underline here is today we have in Africa modern states created by this unique experience. And it's important to keep it in mind when it comes to deal with peace and security issues on the ground. Of course, in the higher discipline, you had several types of literature, of taxonomies, of comments regarding Africa in terms of failed state, failing state, collapsed state, etc. But beyond these common discourses, how can we approach the concept of state in Africa and more broadly in the global South? To what extent Africa has something to contribute to better understand the changing international system? In other words, how state building process in Africa provides an ontological contribution to higher discipline, a priori dedicated to states that make the most difference, to paraphrase the neo-realist higher scholar Kenneth Watts. Allow me to address this questioning by using Pan-Africanism as a theoretical framework. I define Pan-Africanism as an African ambition to build a common political project by aggregating socio-cultural specificities of all driving forces in the region. It is a strategy of social solidarity as well as cultural, political, and economic emancipation among African nations. I refer to the work of Tandika Mukwandariwe. Actually, Pan-Africanism is the oldest and most prominent expression of regionalism. It is a doctrine based on a common vision of what should be desired for the future of all Africans. According to Amitav Acharya, it belongs to a family of regionalist ideologies built on shared conception of history and culture. So it's important here to mention that during the decolonization period in 1950s and 1960s, many African leaders were in favor of political independence vis-à-vis colonial powers, but not necessarily through the creation of Westphalian state model. Rather, the option of a sort of federalist political institution were very popular. At that time, the two African-born blocs, the Casablanca group and the Monrovia group, promoted the vision of African ownership, especially regarding peace and security issues based on the leitmotif, Try Africa First. Prominent leaders of Casablanca Group, Kwame Nkrumah, Gamal Abdel Nasser, even championed the idea of an African army, but they failed to get the support of the Monrovia bloc, composed of moderate African leaders, such as Leopold Sédar Senghor from Senegal, or Nwandi Azikiwe from Nigeria. In any case, modern African states have a congenital link with the Pan-African project, conceived and viewed by its founders as the common horizon of the continent. And the promotion of peace in Africa has always been a key objective of Pan-Africanism, grounded on indigenous culture of shared values. From 1960 to 1980, as mentioned previously, many African countries experienced armed violence following what I call transnational solidarity, which questioned the relevance of the Westphalian model state imposed during independence. To give you an example, to understand the civil war which happened in Côte d'Ivoire, it's important to look at what happened in Sierra Leone and before that in Liberia, precisely because when you have a conflicting situation, the transnational solidarity played a key role because people living to the next door feel that they need to support their brother because the way they identify themselves is more about a specific group. So at the end of the Cold War, African leaders started a conversation on the need to transform the OAU in order to address complex challenges in the region. In that perspective, they issued what is called the Sirte Declaration in 1999, calling for the establishment of a new regional institution. In 2000, Lomé Summit adopted the African Union Constitutive Act, and a new grand organization has been launched 2 years later in South Africa. The African Union today has a clear mandate to promote good governance and sustainable development in the continent, accelerate the process of regional integration, and support the empowerment of African states on the global stage. To do so, peace and stability are crucial. Then, the African Union has launched in 2002 a new institutional framework called the African Peace and Security Architecture, which is dedicated to promote sustainable peace in Africa. So here you have the institutional framework of this IAPSS, where you can see how a key component, Peace and Security Council, is in charge to deal with potentially crisis situation which can challenge stability and peace in the region. Drawing on the Pan-African doctrine, IAPSS is designed following a logic of concentric circle. And it's established in collaboration with African Regional Economic Communities, RECs, in order to prevent and resolve any conflict in the region. Article 16 of the protocol clearly refers to the need to develop constructive cooperation between the African Union as a continental body and REX as sub-regional bodies. And you can see how on the ground the African Union used to partner, for example, with ECOWAS when there is an issue in West Africa, with SADC when there is an issue in the southern part, with IGAD when there is a problem in the eastern part, etc. This is also why African standby forces are designed in various places in the continent, based on the idea to be as closest as possible to the ground. In terms of structure, IAPSS is headed by Peace and Security Commission, which is in charge of the deployment, protection, prevention missions, and other peace enforcing intervention. But many IA institutionalist scholars used to criticize the African Union by arguing that it has been designed in a mimetic way vis-à-vis the European Union. It's partly true. However, the African Union also created within its IAPSS the Panel of Wise, which is a unique institutional innovation inspired by the African traditional practice of l'arbre à palabre, the palaver tree. So these forms of institutional innovation grounded on tradition and realities in Africa is not often valued because the perspective of IA institutionalists is to look always at the main players, main institutions, etc. Here you have the framework of African standby forces, and you can see how, despite the fragmentation of the region, the fragmentation of the continent, you can see how African states try to develop an efficient framework in order to react quickly to prevent any security challenges on the ground. So I argue that IA discipline must shift away from a northern western hierarchical perspective to provide more space for knowledge production and innovation from all corners of our universal world. As underlined by Ove in her work on the use of critical pedagogy, there is a need to break the epistemological and methodological hierarchies in international studies. In a different context, Santos de Souza termed this a sort of epistemocide of knowledges of the South. Such asymmetric configuration prevents us to apprehend what Africa, and more broadly, what the global South can tell us in terms of thinking about international relations. For example, the African Union Agenda 2063, launched in 2013, based on the Pan-African doctrine, has been avant-garde in the way a multilateral framework should define the concept of peace beyond the dichotomy of negative versus positive peace. To some extent, the African Union paved the way to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, by placing people as the raison d'être of its commitment. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, let me share with you this thought of a very well-known Nigerian writer, Chinua Achebe, who wrote in 1988 that Africa is not only a geographical expression, it is also a metaphysical landscape. It is, in fact, a view of the world and the whole cosmos perceived from a particular position. And I invite you to look at his book, Hopes and Impediments. Besides, I would like to underline how after COVID-19 pandemics, our societies, both in the global north and the global south, faced important challenges, which shed light on the need to broaden our scope in order to learn lessons from all relevant experiences that our diverse social morphologies teach us, whether they are local communities, states, or regional organizations. If today Africa continues to experience an unfair access to COVID-19 vaccines, the Africa Joint Continental Strategy for COVID-19 outbreak of the African Union has been successful to secure more than 80% of doses distributed in Africa. While the global framework COVAX, COVID-19 vaccine global access, faces multiple challenges to achieve its goal to deliver 1 billion doses in the region. For your information, October, COVAX has shipped just 288 million doses to all least and middle income countries, including African states. So let me conclude by saying that broader higher discipline should better take profit of the prolific framework that Africa and the Global South represent, beyond a utilitarian logic which consists to collect empirical data from there and to utilize them in the North. Some progress has been made over the last decades in terms of knowledge production, but much work remains to be done in recognizing and incorporating narratives, methodologies, and epistemes developed by Global South scholars into a universalist area as a legitimate contribution to better understanding our changing international arena. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. I think it was so much more faster than we thought. So I open the mic to people who wants to ask question right now, or if you want to send it in the chat, I will read it for you. I totally agree with you, Mr. Degila. We should include more perspectives. And you remind me to Professor Valeria Valle, who was my professor during my master's degree, with this idea of including different perspectives, different theories, and open the door to all these ideas in the South as well. And well, if there are not questions yet, I have one, because you mentioned this role of the Pan-African relationship in the COVID-19 pandemic. And I was just curious about how this is affecting not only the projects you had before, but those for the future. And you know that also vaccines and this vaccination diplomacy now is having a really strong impact in the world. I read that some Africans association have problems with the European Union, for example, because the European Union is not recognizing all the vaccines in the world. So that is a problem. I see the Professor Valeria. Nice to talk to you. I don't know if you have any questions or, yeah, okay, then let me give the mic to the professor.
Well, thank you so much. Merci beaucoup, Professor Degila, for being here in Mexico and here at this Congress of AME. We're also connected with the whole region, the whole Latin America and the Caribbean. We also have an alliance with the Brazilian Association of International Studies. So it's a big pleasure for us to have you. And I love your presentation. It's so nice to learn about Africa from Mexico, because it's a region from the global south. We have a lot of things in common, but unfortunately, African studies from Mexico are not really generalized. So this is why this is very important for us to listen to you. And thank you, Karla. I'm so proud of you. You were my student at the master's program. So I'm so proud of you that you're here. You did an amazing job as moderator. And I have a question for you. Well, I could ask you many questions because it was very provocative. On the first hand, I love the maps. I love the map where you share with us the influence of northern powers in Africa, especially China. Yes, one of my subdisciplines is international cooperation for development, just like yours. Also from international relations, we specialize in international development, and the institute where you work at focus on development studies. So my question has to do with that. In South America, especially, we see, and also in Latin America, that China relates to regions and sub-regions of the global South individually on bilateral basis. So China with Argentina, with Brazil, with Mexico, and with other states individually. So that provokes a division in regions, in sub-regions, at least in Latin America. So my question would be if in Africa, that is also the case. If China relates not only in terms of commercial relations, but with this idea that China projects to the world as a southern country, not as a superpower, but China tries to give this image to the global South community that China belongs to the global South. So how can we analyze this relationship when we have a relationship between China and Mali, China and Benin, China and other countries in Africa? And how can we analyze this in relation to what you told us about the African Union and sub-regional integration processes in Africa? What is this relation between China and these sub-regions? Do we have this disruption of the system when China relates to these countries, or China, on the contrary, is promoting integration in these sub-regions? And especially in terms of distribution of vaccines, because here in the Americas, we had a very important presence of Chinese vaccines that are not accepted in the Northern world, especially in the US and in Western Europe. So this is another question. What was this South-South cooperation between China and Africa regarding the distribution of vaccines? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, dear Valeria, for your great question. Let me start by the question on vaccines, by saying that the situation today in Africa is, in terms of access to vaccine, is quite difficult, because we have less than 5% of vaccinated persons in the region. But of course, vaccine become a diplomatic tool, including a diplomatic tool used by China, but also by other leading players such as the European Union, which is donating thousands of vaccines on the ground. I will say that today China acts as any hegemonic player by using the strengths, by using strategies, by using the same tools as any other leading player in Africa. And vaccine is a great way for China to show how they are very concerned about the situation of their, in brackets, comrades, African friends, etc. But I will say that beyond the vaccine, what the stake here is to what extent African states and African leaders have a clear understanding of something which is not new. Member states within the international system are rational actors trying to promote their interests. And this work with the United States, with European countries, but also with China, which is trying to promote its own interests in Africa. The problem is, and not only in the field of vaccine, the problem broadly is that China sometimes can be very, how to say, persuasive by using, I will say, by using parallel strategies, including, let's say, how things are, including a business under the table. And then the objective is to achieve certain goals. If we need to play a sort of corruption game, we do that. It is a very rational strategy of China. And you can see, and I'm coming to your first question, how China can also use development. I'm sure that you know how they created their sort of development agency. You can have JICA in Japan or GIZ in Germany, USAID in the US, etc. China also used today development aids as a tool of foreign policy by trying to spread its power. And you know that there is this very important project of China, La Route de la Soie. And to achieve this balancing initiative, China developed bilateral partnerships with key geo-strategic countries, for example, in the eastern of Africa, to have access to the Gulf of Aden. China developed an incredible relation with Djibouti, which is not small, but in terms of size, which is a former Francophone country, where China has today a military base. And China developed a lot. I'm privileged to know several diplomats, and particularly the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Djibouti, because they have, I used to train their diplomat there. But China has an incredible strategy. They buy everything. They pay everything. Because for them, it is a very strategic point. And they do that with neighboring countries, which are in the strategic plan of La Route de la Soie. So I will say that China plays the same game as any leading power, including by use an official discourse saying that they are promoting a sort of brotherhood relation, South-South cooperation. But the reality is that China is promoting its own interest in Africa. The other aspect of your question regarding how possibly bilateral relations can break an effort to achieve regional integration or sub-regional integration, I will say that for now, African states used to find what I call a sort of common denominator when it's come to deal with regional projects. And the Pan-African project is really the cornerstone, because this project came up in early 1950s, before the independence. And as I explained in my presentation, many African leaders at that time were not necessarily in favor of having Westphalian modern states, in the sense that we have 55 African states today. The idea was to have a sort of federalist African political body or institution based on this idea of Pan-Africanism. But because of colonial experience, because of what I explained, and African states were not able to achieve this project. And then they finally became independent as, I would say, singular new brand modern states. But in terms of trying to promote a regional project, they used to find a sort of common denominator. I can see, for example, in Geneva, how within the multilateral institutions, when it comes to deal with key issues, African states used to play the game together we are strong. For example, within the WTO, you have this issue of cotton trade, which is important for many African states. I'm sure you are aware about the debate on fair trade and all these issues. On these issues, African states used to find the common denominator because they know that it is the best way for them to promote their interest. Alone, they can do, I will say, nothing almost. But together, it's possible to have a critical voice.
Thank you so much for your reply. Dr. Valle, if you have another question, let us know. Otherwise, we can continue with other questions we have.
Thank you so much. There's another question on the chat.
Yes. We have another question. Diego Silva asked, what is the role of recent foreign investments in Africa in terms of development and cooperation in the region? And how could these investments perhaps affect the sovereignty of African states and their decision-making?
Thank you for this question of Diego Silva. I will start to answer by saying that the main challenge for many years, the main challenge of African states was to attract direct investment, because international investors were very concerned about the stability of African states. And I will say that except a few African states, which were more or less quite stable, and the foreign direct investment in Africa were very, very limited. Now there is a new phase because several African states are trying to provide an appropriate ecosystem to attract foreign investment. For me, it depends on the country, it depends on the domain, because sometimes these investments can produce a negative in results in terms of being an opportunity for few political elites to develop neo-patrimonial practices and to take the control of these investments. And so my answer to your question will be to look at each case, because as I mentioned, Africa is very broad and very complex. And it's in terms also of methodology, when it comes to deal with African issues, it's very important to have what lawyers call a casuistic perspective, a case by case. When you look at investment in South Africa, the reality is completely different in comparison to Congo or to Ethiopia or to Burkina Faso. But I will say, depending on the country investment, when the legal framework and the business environment is okay, these investments can produce positive outcome. In terms of sovereignty, I think it depends again on the national law or national context. If the country has a clear legal system, usually foreign investments produce positive outcome. But if the legal system is not clear, then you can have complex dynamics. For example, the issue of crony capitalism, well developed by Daniel Bach, where you can see foreign investors becoming, I will say, key actors because they feed political elites, in the sense they provide financial resources that these political elite can use to reproduce a system and then to continue to keep the power. And then you can see how strengthening the state institution is key in Africa, in the sense that beyond what we have today as modern African state, there is a need to strengthen institutions, to strengthen how powers is separated between executive power and parliament, justice, etc.
Thank you so much. Is any other question? While someone else send us other question, I would like to ask you more related to this theoretical part. How do you think we can break with those stereotypes of understanding the world from the Western perspective? And how can we from the South continue improving or adding more knowledge from the South to academia, especially in international relations?
This is a great question. I think that it is an issue of cycle. I do believe that knowledge production is also about cycle. And there is a growing cycle of epistemic communities within the Global South, where you have a new generation, but less new generation of scholars trying to keep their distance and produce knowledge based on, I will say, the independent perspective. But the exercise is not easy, precisely because we are living in a globalized world. And so knowledge circulated around. You can ask me, I myself, from Benin, I'm based in a Western university, being professor in Switzerland, and to what extent I'm able to contribute to the debate and provide a sort of a non-Western or African perspective. I think all is about methodology and all is about positionality. This is why I mentioned that Africa and the Global South should not be viewed just as a space to come and pick data, which eventually will be manufactured in the North and resell to the South. And then it's important to provide space for alternative perspective. As you know, there is this movement of decolonization of social science, of IA, etc., which is great. But I think there is no, the tendency of this is very old, at least in the African context. If you look, for example, of what is called the Legon School of International Relations, this epistemic community have been created in the early 1950s, just after independence, by Kwame Nkrumah and others, precisely because they know how it's important to produce grounded knowledge by taking into consideration realities and specificities of Africa and more broadly of the Global South. And so, to answer your question, we need to take into consideration diversity and specificities of the Global South of Africa, not by trying to include these epistemes within the mainstream, but by just providing a space for such alternative way of thinking. I remember very interesting work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, a French socio-anthropologist who is well known for his research about Bororo ethnic groups in Africa. And of course, as a Western researcher, when he started to work on Africa, he went there with his mindset. But finally, he discovered that the way people develop and understand the relationship in a community is completely different. And at the end of his career, he started to include or to take into consideration these specificities, not just to extract raw material and develop it differently, but also provide knowledge, provide space for knowledge from this region. So this is what we have to do, and this takes time, and is an issue of science.
Totally, I agree with you. So in regard to this vaccination diplomacy, how hard do you think it will be for Africa now that with these blocks that Dr. Valle mentioned it, how hard do you think it will be for tourism, for example, or for migration from Africa to Europe, with this idea that vaccines from some countries are not accepted in some others, with this Western or non-Western idea in general? Will it be really difficult for Africa, or is there any Pan-African plan to deal with it?
Well, this is a critical issue, but I think this is an additional critical issue, because as you know, today, what news depicted in developed countries as a sort of massive influx of migrants from the Global South, from Africa, illegal migration, people trying to come to Europe, crossing the Mediterranean. All these things is about issues of visa, access to regular migration, and the issue of of vaccines adds complexity. I think that international organizations should find a way to deal with these issues. I know that WHO, based in Geneva, try to recognize some vaccines from countries other than Western countries. So, for example, recently WHO recognized Sinopharm vaccines, and I think there is a global responsibility to not. We are talking about human mobility issues, but beyond that, we have many challenges regarding simply the ethical aspect. How can you imagine that developing countries sign bilateral agreement with all leading companies to buy, I will say, all vaccines for the coming years by neglecting what is happening somewhere else? So we have here an ethical issue. The issue of the quality of some Chinese vaccine is something additional. So we need to really think about how to have a more balanced global world where people will continue to give the same value to human beings. But the problem is, if we, at least developed countries, play an individualist game, the challenge of COVID-19, COVID-19 doesn't look at borders, visa, Schengen, etc. The COVID-19 virus move everywhere. So if European countries or Western countries don't take into consideration what is happening in the global South, they will experience a backlash. And we need a global response, which includes more solidarity between the North and the South.
Yeah, thank you so much for your reply. And in this line, the Professor Consuelo Davila is asking whether the so-called Chinese vaccine diplomacy will have some political and economic impact in Africa vis-a-vis the European and American hegemony in the continent.
Thank you, dear Consuelo, for your question. I think that for now, African states just welcome any friend or partner which want to contribute to deal with this issue. But in terms of a power relation between China and the other Western leading players, I will say that there is no confrontation, because the needs of African state is so huge that I will say there are space for everyone to contribute. The problem is what extent Chinese or Western countries will be able to include the possibility to produce vaccine in Africa. Behind this question, you have the issue of knowledge transfer. You have the issue of training. You have the issue of how to build an ecosystem. And I will say, beyond having access to vaccine, main challenges today for African states is about training, about infrastructure, about ecosystem, in order to take better profit. Because, the developed countries in which vaccines are produced, they gain a lot of money also. And the companies gain money, the country gain money, and they develop expertise, they develop knowledge, etc. Countries of Africa and many of the global South cannot take profit of this. So another challenge would be, how can we have a more win-win partnership where knowledge can be transferred between the North and the South, and not just being providing vaccine from the North to the South, or from some South countries to other part of South. Partnership should go further and include all these issues of training and knowledge transfer. By doing so, it will be really useful, and it will promote a sort of development, sustainable and economic development also for African states and global South.
Excellent, totally. You have all the reason there, and I think as well that we should, as you mentioned before, be open to other not only perspectives but also open to the new challenges that are coming, and maybe be ready for them with this South-South dialogue between Africa and Latin America, especially Mexico. And I think as well that the role of academia is really important. That's why we are here trying to understand a continent that seems far away from us, but in fact is not. With you, having you here and sharing with us the experience you have. And now I would like to ask you if you have a last, sorry, we have another question apparently from Josue Persquia, talking about post-developed or alternatives to development. The Pan-African project is proposing another way to develop the African countries. Ubuntu is an example.
Oh, thank you very much for this great question. The philosophy of Ubuntu. So first of all, some epistemological reflections. It is very important, I think, not only for higher disciplines, but more broadly for social sciences, to think that the way we approach human societies can be very different depending on where we are. Because there is a tendency to look at the world in a very homogeneous way. If you go, for example, in Benin, my native country, and if you go in a small village far away where I am from, you can see people with maybe very limited material things. Maybe they don't have a new run computer, they don't have this TV, this, but they're happy. They're happy with their life. They live in a different way where they value social relation. They value social interaction. They value the need to take care of the ecosystem, to take care of the nature, etc. So the epistemology of these social units is completely different. And if you don't take into consideration their own realities, you will analyze or you will judge them with your lenses, but you will not very understand what is important for them. So the concept of Ubuntu is precisely a concept of the transactional relation between individuals and the group. I exist because others exist. I'm not unique. the definition of what I am is in relation with what others are. And together we are part of a cosmogony. And this perspective is very important. And I invite you to look at the book of one of my very good friend and colleague, Felwine Sarr, Afrotopia, when he explained that episteme are very important. And to answer the question of Josue Peruskia, Africa has to find its own way to develop its, I would say, economic public policies toward the well-being of its population. Development is not something which should be imposed from outside. There is a need of ownership, and ownership is particularly important because it is the best way to succeed. If you look at the reports on all these Bretton Woods institutions, program, policies, plans, etc., in many African places, where they try to develop with their toolkits, what is the result today? So if you don't take into consideration realities on the ground and people, their perspective, if you don't include them in a logic of what I call co-development, if you don't provide space for to hear their perspective, if a World Bank expert come to Benin, to Nigeria, to Ethiopia, to Congo, etc., with their ideas to develop people, I'm not sure the result will be the top. SDGs is a very interesting framework, a global framework, and it's clear that there is a need to have a national level to push for the implementation. And what Josue called post-developed alternatives, I think, yes, it is about how people try to build a future by taking into consideration their indigenous realities. And this is the best way to proceed if we want to succeed.
Thank you so much for your reply. Mr. Degila, I think it's time for you to give us a last comment about the topic. And when you finish, we will close the event. So please go ahead.
Thank you. I will just say that Africa and more broadly the Global South has a lot to provide in terms of the ontology of IA, and it's important for the mainstream IA to provide space to hear what these peripheries of the international system can tell us, because by decentering the perspective, we can have a more heuristic global IA to better understand challenges in a changing world. Thank you very much for your invitation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure having you here. And on behalf of the Mexican Association of International Studies and the Faculty of Political and Social Science of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, we say thank you for being here, for participating and collaborating with us, with the Mexican academia. We are looking forward to having you here again really soon. And to all the attendees, thank you so much for being here. I shared with you the profile of our speaker in the chat for you to follow him and his work really closely. And we hope that you enjoy it and you learn a lot from this presentation that was extremely good. Thank you so much again, and see you soon. Merci beaucoup.
Merci de votre accueil et j'espère pouvoir revenir au Mexique bientôt en personne.
Oui, ça sera bellissime. Thank you so